For nearly 2,000 years, one face has ruled the imagination of humanity. A man with pale skin, soft European features, light-colored flowing hair. His image covered cathedral ceilings, watched over prayers, crossed oceans with missionaries and empires, entered homes, churches, paintings, stained glass, films, books, and eventually the imagination of the entire world. But what if the most recognized face in human history was never meant to be a historical portrait at all? Did it ever occur to you that the Bible never actually tells us what Jesus looked like? No eye color, no skin tone, no height, no detailed facial description, and yet somehow billions inherited one very specific face. So where did it come from? And why does the deeper historians travel backward into the ancient world, the less familiar that image begins to feel? But wait, because this story is not only about paintings, it is about empire, memory, power, colonization, exile, oppression, and perhaps one of the greatest identity transformations in human history. Because the deeper we go, the stranger the story becomes. Before archaeology, before forensic reconstructions, before documentaries and historical analysis, there was the image, the European Jesus. For centuries, this became the dominant visual identity of Christ across the Western world. But here is the strange part. The Bible itself gives almost no physical description of Jesus. Think about that. The most famous face in human history comes from a book that barely describes him physically at all. No Roman sketch survives, no verified portrait from eyewitnesses, no preserved image from the disciples. So how did the modern world become so certain about his appearance? The answer lies not only in religion, but in art. As Christianity spread through civilizations, artists naturally painted sacred figures through the lens of their own cultures. Europe painted European faces. Ethiopia painted African faces. Asia painted Asian faces. At first, that may not seem important until you realize what happened next. Over centuries, one image spread farther than all the others. The European image crossed continents through colonial expansion, cathedrals, illustrated Bibles, paintings, sculptures, missionary movements, and eventually global media itself. Slowly, art became memory, and memory became assumed history. But wait, because the deeper historians moved backward toward first-century Judea, the harder one question became to ignore. If Jesus was born in the ancient Middle East, what did that world actually look like? The world Jesus entered did not resemble medieval Europe. It was ancient Judea, a land of desert winds, Roman occupation, crowded markets, fishermen, shepherds, rebels, refugees, priests, and travelers moving across ancient trade routes. This was not an isolated civilization. It stood at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world. And perhaps this is where modern imagination begins to crack. Because the Bible did not emerge from isolated Europe. It emerged from one of the most connected regions on earth. Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Jews, Arabs, African kingdoms, merchants from distant lands. This was the world surrounding Jesus. A world far more connected and complex than many modern portrayals suggest. And this next detail changes everything. The people of ancient Israel were Semitic peoples, indigenous to the Levant region of the Middle East. They lived beneath intense sunlight, generation after generation. Farmers, stoneworkers, builders, fishermen. Did it ever occur to you that geography leaves fingerprints on human history? and history leaves fingerprints on the human face. Modern forensic reconstructions based on ancient Semitic populations suggest darker hair, brown eyes, olive to darker skin tones, rugged features, shaped by climate and outdoor labor, and shorter stature, far removed from the pale royal portraits painted centuries later in Europe. Not because of ideology, not because of politics, because geography matters, climate matters, history matters. But wait, the story becomes even more complicated, because this is no longer only about appearance, it is about memory. Why do so many modern audiences instinctively imagine biblical history through Europe? Because images repeated long enough stop feeling symbolic. They begin feeling historical. And perhaps that is why these conversations become emotional. Because people are not only defending paintings, they are defending memory, tradition, childhood, identity. But history keeps whispering the same uncomfortable reminder. Jesus was born in the Middle East, not medieval France, not Renaissance Italy, not Victorian England. And the deeper archaeology moves backward in time, the harder inherited imagery becomes to reconcile with the ancient world itself. But wait, because Africa was never outside that world. In fact, the ancient world would have found that idea almost impossible to understand. Africa was deeply connected to the biblical story from the beginning. Egypt appears throughout Scripture. Abraham fled there during famine. Joseph rose to power there. Israel multiplied there. Moses confronted empire there. Did you realize one of the most influential stories in human history, the Exodus itself, unfolded on African soil? And suddenly the Bible begins feeling different, closer, more human, more connected, because Scripture was never disconnected from migration, empire, suffering, and survival. It emerged from those realities. Even after the Exodus, Africa remained deeply connected to the biblical world. The Bible repeatedly mentions Kush, regions associated with Nubia, Sudan, and areas connected to ancient Ethiopia. Trade routes connected these civilizations constantly. And then something remarkable happened. According to the Book of Acts, one of the earliest recorded Christian conversions involved an Ethiopian official traveling from Jerusalem. Think about that. Long before much of Europe embraced Christianity, ancient African Christian communities already existed. But wait, the story gets even more interesting. By the 4th century, the kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia had officially embraced Christianity, while much of Europe still remained divided between pagan traditions and emerging Christian influence. Ancient Ethiopian believers preserved scriptures, liturgies, sacred art, fasting traditions, and forms of worship that survived for centuries. And hidden among mountains and cliffs, they carved churches directly into stone itself. Massive sanctuaries illuminated by candlelight, while empires rose and collapsed beyond their walls. Inside many of these churches, Jesus appeared with African features, not necessarily because Ethiopians claimed Jesus was ethnically Ethiopian, but because humanity naturally imagines the sacred through familiar faces. Europe did the same. Asia did the same. Every civilization did it. But over time, one image spread farther than the others. And this is where history becomes uncomfortable. Because as European colonial influence expanded across continents, European Christian imagery expanded with it. Missionaries carried paintings. Churches displayed European icons. Illustrated Bibles spread Western imagery across the globe. Slowly, one artistic tradition overshadowed countless others. Ancient African Christian imagery, Middle Eastern depictions, Eastern traditions. Much of it faded, into the background of global memory. But traces survived, and the deeper historians investigate, the stranger the story becomes. Because this next realization changes the emotional meaning entirely. The Bible does not emerge from comfort. It emerges from survival. Again and again, Scripture returns to the same cycle. Empire rises, people suffer, families flee, kingdoms collapse, exile begins. The Israelites experienced slavery in Egypt, exile in Babylon, occupation beneath Rome. Generation after generation carried the memory of displacement. And perhaps this explains why suffering people across history kept recognizing themselves inside biblical stories. Because suffering recognizes suffering. Exile recognizes exile. And nowhere is this more visible than in the figure of Jesus himself. Jesus was not born into political power. He entered the world beneath Roman occupation. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Heavy taxes burdened ordinary people. Violence shaped daily life. Even his birth took place far from royal comfort. No palace, no army, no throne. Just a child born among the overlooked. And then something happened many people rarely stop to think about. According to the gospel narrative, Mary and Joseph fled into Egypt with the infant Jesus. Think about that for a moment. The Son of God entered history as a refugee, running from political violence, crossing borders, seeking survival. Why does that matter? Because displaced people across history understand that fear instantly. And perhaps this is one reason suffering communities across civilizations kept recognizing themselves inside Scripture. The poor recognized him. The oppressed recognized him. The rejected recognized him. For enslaved Africans in the Americas, the Exodus story became more than ancient history. It became survival. Pharaoh became the symbol of oppression. Moses became the symbol of deliverance. The promised land became hope itself. Spiritual songs carried these themes across generations. Go down, Moses. Let my people go. And perhaps this is why the image of Jesus spread across so many cultures. Not because every civilization agreed on his appearance, but because wounded people recognized compassion in his story. The suffering recognized mercy. The rejected recognized dignity. The oppressed recognized liberation. But wait, what if humanity has been asking the wrong question this entire time? Maybe the deepest mystery was Jesus white? Maybe the real question is, why does humanity constantly recreate the sacred in its own image? Kings did it. Empires did it. Artists did it. Civilizations did it. And perhaps humanity still does it now. But before we replace one oversimplified narrative with another danger appears. Because the ancient world did not think in modern racial categories. Those categories came much later. The ancient world was more fluid, more connected, more complicated. And perhaps that forgotten complexity changes everything. Because once the layers of centuries begin falling away, the Bible no longer feels trapped inside Renaissance Europe. It returns to deserts, occupied lands, stone villages, trade routes, brown-skinned Semitic peoples beneath Middle Eastern sunlight. The ancient world breathes again. And perhaps that is what unsettles people most. Not the possibility that history disappeared, but the realization that history may have been slowly repainted in plain sight for centuries. After all the paintings, all the arguments, all the empires, all the centuries of reshaping memory, one truth still rises above them all. There is only one Jesus, not the Jesus trapped inside politics, not the Jesus shaped by empire, not the Jesus recreated through racial identity. The real Jesus walked beneath Middle Eastern sunlight, among the poor, the wounded, the forgotten, the rejected. And according to Scripture, he is coming again. not for one race, not for one nation, not for one civilization, but for people from every tribe, every language, every background, across all of history. And maybe that was always the point. Humanity became obsessed with the image, while the message was always bigger than the image. Because, in the end, salvation was never about looking like Jesus. It was about following him.